Us men, we have a natural tendency to be problem solvers. When most of us are faced with a problem, we instinctively look for ways to solve it. Oftentimes, this can create problems with our significant others. For most of us men in this audience, I would assume your significant other is of the female persuasion, but there are some parishioners of Woke United Methodists that hate watch this channel every day. God only knows how their significant other chooses to identify. Male birthing person, emotional support shovel, gender non-binary, dandelion, who knows? Whatever the case may be though, it does not change the way nature works. If your emotional support shovel approaches you with a problem, it is instinctive for a man to do everything that he can to solve it. When most of the time, our wives, our girlfriends, they just want us to listen. They don't want us to solve. They don't want us to be the hero. They just want us to listen. I know I struggle with the listening part sometimes. I'm sure most of you guys do too. But in the case of one of ESPN's dozens of significant others, ESPN Radio, the problem has needed to be addressed for years now. Executives at ESPN, they have been listening to the problem. They have heard their spouse complaining about sagging ratings, disappearing revenue. The problem is, executives at ESPN, they seem to be lacking the masculine instinct to solve the problem. Sure, they have put band-aids on the wound the size of Joy Behar's Superdome. They put in half-assed attempts to try and stop the bleeding, but for many years now, ESPN Radio has been treated like the mistress instead of being treated like the wife. It wasn't all that long ago that ESPN Radio was the premier sports radio network in the country. Just listen to this lineup. Your day starts off with Mike and Mike in the morning. Now, longtime viewers of this channel know I was never a big fan of Mike and Mike. Thought they were boring. I thought they played it safe. But looking back at it now, that is exactly what ESPN wanted, and that's the biggest problem at the network. Mike and Mike, they were followed by Colin Cowherd. Now, during the 2000s and early 2010s, I was an everyday listener of Colin Cowherd. I liked Cowherd because he was different than everyone else. Now, sure, he's got some ridiculous takes. He's often wrong with his predictions or his opinions, but who cares? This is entertainment. I wasn't listening to Colin Cowherd because he was always right. I was listening because he was always entertaining. Afternoon Drive was dominated by Dan Patrick, arguably one of the greatest to ever do it. Dan Patrick, absolute legend. Hell, the entire lineup at ESPN Radio back then was legendary. Obviously, though, we all know what happened. Dan Patrick left, Colin Cowherd left. For reasons that no one can figure out to this day, ESPN separated Mike and Mike and eventually parted ways with Mike Golick. Ever since then, ESPN Radio has been a graveyard. It's been the place where media careers go to perish. For almost 10 years, ESPN has treated its radio division like a cucumber at the Pride Parade. Once the cucumber has been shrunk, it's tossed away for a new one. ESPN's thrown a rotating panel of failures into ESPN Radio with the hopes that one of these failures would manage to draw an audience. When the failure inevitably failed, ESPN tossed them aside and tried another failure. Bomani Jones, Keyshawn Johnson, Mike Golick and his son, Mikey? Whatever the fuck, doesn't matter what his name is. Max Kellerman, Jay Williams, failure. But that's okay. That's okay. Because the brilliant executives at ESPN, they have come up with an excellent strategy to please their mistress. This idea is guaranteed to prevent ESPN Radio from sinking to the bottom of the woke sea. So what is this brilliant strategy? Throwing a shitload of money at Colin Cowherd. When I saw this news earlier this morning, I was incredibly confused. For the first time in the last 2, maybe 3 years, executives at ESPN, they have thought of something that would actually work. Typically, their decision-making's been downright atrocious, like extending the contract of Michael Kay and Peter Beater Rosenberg after they have been dominated on radio in New York City for years now. But if ESPN could convince Colin Cowherd to return to the worldwide leader in woke, that could be a game changer for ESPN Radio. The question is, can they do it? There is no doubt that ESPN's got the money to make an appealing offer. Hell, they've just freed up tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars by eliminating the woke welfare of hundreds of people. But for Colin Cowherd, Would the money be worth it? Because, like we talked about with Pat McAfee the other day, ESPN doesn't give you millions of dollars for free. They don't offer you millions of dollars in exchange for your services. That money comes with a caveat, and the caveat is you got to represent their beliefs. According to Front Office Sports, now that ESPN has signed Pat McAfee, their next big target is Colin Cowherd. But KC, what about Shannon Sharpe? Shay? Shay? Really? Shannon Sharpe? Shay is like the appetizer. Shay is the co-star who sits next to the real star, which is why there are rumors that ESPN wants to pair him with Stephen A. Smith on Woke Take. And when I say star, I'm not talking about levels of fame. Everyone knows Shannon Sharpe is extremely famous. When I say star, I'm talking about someone who has the ability to draw ratings, draw an audience. Shay was on FS1 for years with Skip Bayless and couldn't attract flies to a fresh flatulence courtesy of the whoopee cushion on The View. Pat McAfee is a draw. Colin Cowherd is a draw. According to Front Office Sports, Colin Cowherd's contract with FS1 expires at the end of the 2024 NFL season. I would assume that means his contract goes through February of 2025. But the contract is irrelevant. Just like the NBA, these media contracts, they are meaningless. Shannon Sharpe had plenty of time left on his contract, and he managed to get out of his marriage with Skippy Bayless in less than 30 days. Contract ain't the problem. The money ESPN can offer, not the problem. With Colin Cowherd, the problem's going to be what ESPN expects to receive in exchange for all that money. I have read a couple of media articles this morning pertaining to this story. They all claim that ESPN dropped Colin Cowherd back in 2015 and he ended up signing with FS1, but that's not exactly how I remember it going down. Yes, ESPN did yank him off the air in the summer of 2015. I can't remember the exact reason. I think Colin Cowherd said something about some unknown Major League Baseball player. It triggered fake outrage on Twitter, so ESPN did what ESPN does best. They overreacted and pulled Colin Cowherd off the air. But he was already out the door at that point. He was already leaving ESPN for FS1. By pulling him off the air, they just expedited his departure by a couple of weeks. Returning to ESPN, that would be one of the biggest mistakes in Colin Cowherd's media career. Do you remember the reason he left ESPN for Fox to begin with? It wasn't for a larger audience. Back in 2015, FS1 was just getting started. Hell, here we are 8 years later, and they still have a fraction of the audience that ESPN has. There were two reasons that Colin Cowherd left ESPN, and they both tie into each other. Creative freedom and the freedom to pursue other interests. Keyword, freedom. His Volume podcast network, that's not happening at ESPN. The freedom to do whatever the hell he wants on his radio show, that's not happening at ESPN. You don't have to take my word for it. Go listen to the very first episode of The Herd on FS1, and Colin Cowherd, he'll tell you himself. Recently, Dan Patrick was interviewed by Barrett Sports Media. They discussed his time at ESPN. Dan Patrick admitted, "I could not be myself at the worldwide leader in woke. I don't feel like I've seen the real Dan Patrick until I left ESPN." Dan Le Batard, same thing. Charlie Arnold, same thing. How many former ESPN personalities have left the network and then admitted to being silenced, admitted to being inauthentic? Why in the hell would Colin Cowherd want to return to that environment? It's essentially media prison. I know many people believe that old adage that money talks, and in some cases, that's true. There are people who can be bought. There are people who are willing to betray themselves and pretend to be something that they're not. Case in point, Mark Jones at ESPN. Mark Jones pretends to combat mythical racism. He pretends to be the ultimate victim, when in reality, Mark Jones is married to a white woman who lives in the suburbs and sends his kids to private school. Does that sound like a victim to you? I don't know Colin Cowherd personally, but in his case, I don't think this is going to be about the money. It's going to be about the freedom. And you can't have both at ESPN. You can't have the money while also having the freedom. The truth is, ESPN's already got someone that can save their struggling radio division, Pat McAfee. But I think they are afraid to put him on radio because they think he'll violate FCC standards. They wouldn't have to worry about that with Colin Cowherd, but again, why would he want to return to that environment of fear? Why would he want to return to a network that is afraid of the overreactions on Twitter? Colin Cowherd has everything at Fox besides the audience on television. Successful radio show, freedom to launch his own podcasting network, and who knows? Who knows? Maybe FS1 will be able to surpass ESPN in the ratings on television. For the first time ever, FS1 is available in more homes than ESPN. Just think about that. What does that tell you? People are no longer willing to pay for ESPN. Cable and satellite companies, they are getting tired of their exorbitant fees. I just don't see it. I don't see it. I don't see Colin Cowherd leaving FS1 in the freedom to return to ESPN. Quick side note here, in case you guys are interested. Netflix, they just released a documentary on Jake Paul. I think it's called Untold Jake Paul is a Problem Child, or Jake Paul the Problem Child, something like that. It was brought to my attention yesterday that I actually make an appearance in this documentary. They pulled a clip from a video that I made on Jake Paul 12 or 18 months ago. The clip of me in the documentary, it only lasts for about 2 seconds, somewhere around the 20-minute mark. So if you're interested, you can go check it out. I haven't finished the documentary just yet, but from what I saw, it looks pretty good. I recommend it. Anyway, give me your thoughts on Colin Cowherd. What do you think? I think it would be the biggest mistake of his media career, but could you see him returning to ESPN? Let me know. Sound off in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe. Click the notification bell to receive all notifications from the channel. Best way to contact me is by email at btlkc84@gmail.com, KC_BTL84 on Twitter. I'll see you guys later.